Okay, we'll have a few questions at the end of this session of 3, and the next speaker is going to be on Zoom, and it's Riccardo Manzotti from Italy. Riccardo was the host of the Science of Consciousness conference in Taormina just last May, and we're very pleased to have him at the Revolution right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for allowing me to connect from Italy. I couldn't get there. I'm really sorry about that. It would have been great to be there with you. And I'm here to present a radical hypothesis that I believe it's going to be quite surprising for many people listening, and a hypothesis that I think it is somehow very consistent with what Paavo, which I thank for the previous talk, and with some of Stewart's theory, hypotheses and approaches. Because I think that, as Paavo just explained, right now we are really in a dire need of a Kuhnian paradigm shift. For many, many years so far, people have been trying to find a way for consciousness to be produced inside the brain. And we all know that all such attempts have failed. They have failed because so far nobody had been able to find anything like consciousness just because of neural activity in the classical picture of neural activity. And it is very surprising that people are still hoping that neurons are switching on and off and firing in the traditional, let's say, model may produce anything like our everyday experience of the world. So we must ask ourselves, why consciousness had been such a big problem for so many years? Why it had been impossible to find a solution? And Thomas Kuhn himself introduced the notion of pseudo-problems. He said that many times when a problem seems to be totally intractable in science, it's not because the world is really difficult to understand, but it is because we are starting on the wrong foot. We are starting from a wrong assumption, or to use the word by Galileo in Bertolt Brecht's play, but the Galileo is not the real one, but the character introduced by Bertolt Brecht, we pretend to know something we don't really know. So my point is that, and that's basically the way in which I'm going to introduce this hypothesis, is that the problem of consciousness had been so difficult because we started from a wrong assumption that we never call into question. Something that may be common to all the theories that Paavo right now outlined. Something that all those theories are unaware. They are taking for granted. And so we need to focus and to see whether we can see something that has hampered, that has make the quest for consciousness so far impossible. And I believe that this idea might be the so-called, the wrong assumption, might be to look for consciousness inside our head, inside the activity of neurons. This is not to say that consciousness is not physical. Neither is to say that consciousness is not somehow a product of what is taking place in the brain. So wait for a second, because then I will show you that what people are right now doing in quantum mechanical approaches with consciousness might be very helpful to understand what is consciousness. But it is to say that consciousness might not be literally a physical phenomenon inside the brain. Does this mean that consciousness is not a physical phenomenon? No, not at all. It only means that consciousness doesn't have to take place inside the brain. So what is the alternative solution to this, the alternative approach? The way to get out of this pseudo problem, to use Thomas Kuhn's words. And the reply, the possible answer is that the physical thing that might be identical, that might be one with what we call consciousness, conscious experience, might be the external reality, the external world, not just the activity taking place inside the brain, but the world itself. My point is that the world, which is the cause of what's taking place in the brain, and then I will get to quantum mechanics, the world has all the properties that we are looking for in consciousness. The world is made of, the sun is made of mountains, is made of rainbows, is made of colors. Everything is there in the world. Everything has to be in the physical world. Only because we assume that we are inside the head, we look for something like the world inside the head. Think about that. And how do we call this world 2.0 that we desperately look for inside the head? We've been calling experience or consciousness or phenomenal whatever. But there is no need to look for phenomenal experience, alias consciousness, inside the head if we just didn't assume that the physical portion of the brain that might be identical with us is not the neural activity in the brain, but rather the physical world. This is a little bit childish painting that I'm using at behind me is just a wall in my country house that I just had fun with my young son to paint, just to provide some kind of image to make clear what I mean. So for years, I mean, consider this, that right now, take myself as an example. Right now, I have a physical body, a physical head, and a physical brain, of course. Everything is physical. There's no point for me. I'm a physicalist, so everything has to be physical. But at this very moment, my body is surrounded by the physical reality. If we consider just standard perception, what do we find? It is very much like consciousness. And the reply is, we find it in the world. And we felt the need to deal with consciousness as though consciousness was something special only because we insisted for centuries, basically as of Galileo and Descartes, to look for consciousness inside the head, inside the central nervous system. And therefore, since the central nervous system doesn't have any of the properties of what we find in our existence, we draw the conclusion that consciousness had to be something that was something special, something unique, something invisible. And we call it phenomenal. Basically, phenomenal, paradoxically, is a paradoxical term, in my view. I'm a philosopher and also an engineer. I've been working on AI. The notion of phenomenon or phenomenal is paradoxical because it is something that has the role of appearing without being visible. Because no neuroscientist is expecting to find inside the brain anything like, a picture, a three-dimensional picture that can be shown to his colleagues. Everybody knows that in the brain, if you look inside the brain, you're just going to find neurotransmitters firing, spikes, and whatever. But such things are very interesting physical activities, but they are not anything like our experience. Where do we find something, say, like a rainbow, or like a mountain, or like a village? We find it in the physical world. So the paradigm shift, the revolution that I am suggesting, is to turn upside down the relation between inside and outside, between the inner world and the outer world, and rejecting such notion. There isn't such a thing as an inner world. In nature, there isn't any inner world. In nature, everything is just third person. It is just a plain, in plain view. Everything. I like to say in a different context that nature isn't shy. Nature is in plain view. And that's the point. But now that's where quantum mechanics, I think, may provide a better explanation of this hypothesis that I'm making, that admittedly is very bold, because it's turning upside down the expected relation between the body, the brain, and the world, and where quantum mechanics allows us to see things in a different perspective. You're all familiar with the classic problem of the observer in quantum mechanics and the collapse of the wave function. You're all familiar with the fact that the classic two examples that every schoolboy knows, namely the dual slit experiment and the Schrödinger's cat. And you're all also familiar that in quantum mechanics, some approaches like the relational interpretation by Carlo Rovelli suggest that the object is relative, that there isn't such a thing as an electron before the experimental apparatus. There isn't such a thing as a dead or alive cat between the act of observation, and likewise that possibly the object comes into existence at the time of its measurement. Now, and I'm getting to the conclusion because I have a I'm very lucky of having this slot at the beginning of this conference, but it's quite brief, so I need to put a lot of stuff inside. So, what's the connection between quantum mechanics, possibly in the relational interpretation, and the mind-object identity? The connection lies in the fact that mind-object identity suggests to swap the traditional position of the observer and the observed event. So, for example, to use the example of the dual slit experiment, rather than thinking that we have an electron and then we have the observer at the end of the measurement, what if what we've always been calling the observer were not at the end of the physical process that ends with a measurement, but at the beginning? Namely, what if when, for example, the observer, what we call the observer, was not the act of measurement, but was rather the cause that impinges on the act of measurement? This suggestion, which is how could I call it? A kind of conceptual revolution, doesn't change anything from a physical empirical perspective on what we know about quantum mechanics, but it allows us to put consciousness in a totally different point in the quantum mechanical description of the physical reality. And by doing that, the mind-object identity is able to provide a quantum mechanical view of the physical world in a totally different perspective relative to consciousness. In such a view, according to mind-object identity, together with quantum mechanics, the physical processes, like those studied by Stuart Hameroff and other people that are looking for the actual existence of structures that allow the collapse of the wave function, for example, among other things, may have a different role. We would no longer expect those activities inside the microtubules or inside neurons to produce phenomenal experience inside the brain. We would look at those processes inside the brain as the condition for the collapse of relative macro-physical objects in the external world. So to draw a conclusion, and I hope I've been in the allowed time, for example, also to get out of only micro-physical object, let's consider just a macroscopical object like a rainbow, which is, I think, an interesting case in which we show that the idea of relative existence that had been around in philosophy and in science ever since the ancient Greeks, and even more lately with quantum mechanics, may provide us with the notion that all objects, starting from microphysical phenomena, but up to macroscopical objects like a rainbow or like everything basically around me, are objects that take place in a certain way, and therefore that they exist thanks to the end of a physical chain that ends in the brain. But crucially, the end is not what we are. According to the mind-object hypothesis, we are not the end of such processes that ends possibly in the microtubules or in other structures in the brain, but we are the beginning of such processes. We are not the detection of the electron, but we are whatever was the electron thanks to that detection layer. And that's the idea behind the mind object, the identity with the external cause, the external object, rather than the identity with the measurement. In such a way, I think it will be possible to solve the problem of the observer and to place consciousness in the physical world. I see that my time has elapsed. I see the presenter. I thank you very much for showing up, and let me say hello to everyone once again, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for packing that in so well. So our next presenter is also remote, Tom Bever from University of Arizona, Tucson, Center for Consciousness Studies. And do we have him queued up? So we'll have questions at the end of the session, basically eating into the break a little bit. And after this 3 mini session, we go straight into another mini session of 3. Then we have the break, and before that, we can have some brief questions. Should we have a question right now? If we're yeah.
So I don't know if we still have Riccardo, but my question is, like, the blueness I see on that screen, is that the world or phenomenal consciousness? I'm a little confused by what he's proposing, like, very basically.
That's for Riccardo. Okay, Riccardo, are you still with us? Did you hear the question?
Yeah. Yes. I heard the question. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah. Yes. We're here.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm a realist about color. So the blueness is the whatever it is on the screen. And it might be different, for example, for different people, because different people have different bodies. And having a different body means to have a different reference frame. So it is perfectly possible that that on the screen, external to everyone's, to different people's bodies, there are different relative blues, but the blues, the colors, are in the world and not in one's consciousness. So the idea is to basically relocate everything that we've been looking for inside phenomenal experience, just as properties, physical properties of the physical world.